Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.
Hello again, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. With about 14,000 cases and now more than 200 deaths, coronavirus continues to shadow Arkansas. Nonetheless, commerce here, as elsewhere, is resuming. Business interests and Republican lawmakers have been pressuring Governor Hutchinson for weeks to call a special legislative session, fearing what they termed frivolous lawsuits by employees and customers that might arise from COVID-19. On Monday, Mr. Hutchinson met them halfway, declining a special session but signing executive orders to raise the standard of proof in any such complaints. There was immediate pushback from opposition Democrats, Labor, and the plaintiffs' bar, who faulted the higher evidentiary threshold and challenged the governor's authority to impose it. Both sides now. Charlie Spakes is president of the Arkansas Grocers and Retail Merchants Association, and Carter Stein is an attorney with the McMath Woods firm of Little Rock. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us. Charlie Spakes, we'll start with you. This is exactly what you wanted from state government, or close enough?
It is close enough. I think it just provides some certainty for businesses that want to reopen. So I think for the most part, all of my members and retailers and grocers around the state are pleased with it.
Carter Stein.
Yeah, so I'm not really sure how this provides certainty, because I'm not really sure that there's a crisis or even a potential crisis for COVID-19 related litigation. So again, I'm not really sure how this provides certainty, and I'm not sure how this is constitutional.
Well, let's start with the constitutional part first there. This would seem, I think, some attorneys on both sides have said to me, this has got lawsuit or legal challenge written all over it. It seems to fly in the face of the state constitution. Carter Stein.
Yeah, so we have three co-equal branches of government, and here we have the governor by executive order essentially saying that there are limitations now on the types of lawsuits that can be brought. The Supreme Court has already spoken on this issue in the last couple of years. Any change to the Constitution needs to be approved by the voters at the ballot box.
Charlie Spakes.
Yeah, I'm an attorney, but probably not as distinguished as my colleague over here. But it wasn't our first choice. We'd much rather a special session and for it to be legislatively done. It wasn't done like that. So, my members aren't attorneys. They're just small businesses around the state that are pleased with what happened.
Well, the question was, not only can Mr. Hutchinson, is there some question about whether Mr. Hutchinson can do this by executive order, but whether any legislation passed by the General Assembly would withstand a challenge. Your thoughts on that?
That's up to state attorneys and attorneys around the state and the Supreme Court and courts to decide. We have separate branches of government, and if a legislative body decides it's something that they're willing to take up and hear from enough constituents and businesses in their area to make the fight worth it, then they'll do that. And, we're not attorneys. We're just asking for reasonable protections.
Well, is it reasonable, though? Mr. Stein seems to suggest that, as have others, that it's a solution without a problem, at least thus far.
Well, if that's the deal, then you shouldn't be too worried about this. This executive order only goes until the end of his emergency declaration. If it's something you don't think you can bring anyways, this doesn't change much, in our opinion. It provides some certainty for people that are scared about frivolous lawsuits. Others say, don't be scared. But those are people that don't own small businesses and don't have their lives at stake.
Carter Stein.
Well, I respectfully disagree with that statement. I'm a partner in a small business, and certainly our business has been affected by COVID-19. We haven't had any trial dates since March, and that's tough on our small business. It's tough on our clients who are seeking justice. But as a law firm, we're not out here asking for any special protection. we know that as long as we are acting reasonably, and that's the common law standard for negligence, the reasonable person, we know that if we're acting reasonably, following the Department of Health's directives, following CDC guidance, that we're not going to be sued for our actions. But what this executive order does is changes that burden of proof from the reasonable person standard all the way to essentially a punitive damages standard. You have to prove recklessness, willful or wanton, or intentional conduct. So it really heightens that standard. Again, I don't think there's going to be any litigation that comes from this because these cases would be difficult or nearly impossible to prove, and I'm happy to talk about that more later. But it does concern me about the future and what may be coming down the road for the legislature. Well,
speak of that for just a second. Take a moment for that, if you will. The nose under the tent, is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, you know, if you're a hammer, you're always looking for a nail, right? And so if tort reform is what you're pushing, now you got a little bit of tort reform by executive order. Maybe the next time the legislature meets next year, maybe we want a little bit more of that tort reform. And so certainly that concerns me for the citizens of this state.
Well, Mr. Spakes, are we talking about a bar that is just unreasonably high in terms of clients, customers, patients? This executive order would cover healthcare workers as well. Charlie Spakes?
Yeah, like I said, I don't represent healthcare workers, so I don't want to speak to that aspect of it. We're afraid I might misspeak, but we don't think so. We think it protects people that are acting reasonable, that aren't maliciously disregarding CDC and the health department guidelines. And there's certainty where CDC, and we've seen from the WHO, CDC, the health department, where these guidelines are not always the same. And they mix and match and they change. At first, at one point, you really didn't need masks. Now it's all stated that you do need masks. So, my people it's in their best interest to protect employees and customers. They just want to be able to do that without a shadow of litigation over their head.
Well, Carter Stein, that shadow, it's real, is it not?
Well, if it's real, then where are the lawsuits? Governor Hutchinson, I believe on Monday at his press conference, said that he was unaware of any COVID-19 related lawsuits in Arkansas. So I understand that there's this perceived threat of litigation, but it hasn't happened so far in Arkansas. And this pandemic started in March, and here we are in mid-June. The reality is any type of infectious disease case is a very, very difficult case to prove. For example, if we take one of Mr. Spakes' clients, a grocery store, and someone says, hey, I want to sue the grocery store because I contracted COVID-19 at their store. If they were to come to my law office, the first question I would ask them is, okay, you went to that grocery store. Where else did you go? This isn't a situation where people are invalid in a nursing home or at a state correctional facility. These people that are able to go to grocery stores are also able to go to other places. And so any plaintiff's attorney is going to have the burden of proof to show proximate cause. You have to show that they contracted this virus at this specific location. And then on top of that, you would have to prove that the store was acting unreasonably. Now, that would have been under the common law negligence standard. Now, with this executive order, you'd have to prove that the store acted willfully, wantonly, intentionally, or recklessly, which is, again, a very high standard. But even if we didn't have the executive order, I don't think these lawsuits would be coming forward. They haven't come forward in the first 3 months. Why would they start now?
Well, Mr. Spakes, your response.
Well, I mean, just because they haven't come here as of yet, it's not preposterous to think they can or will. There's certainly these cases that are in the U.S. Against Walmarts, against grocery stores, against retailers. So, and our thought is if people don't think that these will come anyways, then this really doesn't impact you unless you're worried about future legislation, which my businesses aren't right now. They're trying to get through this pandemic and keep the economy rolling and workers working and the states and cities and everything running smoothly.
There was the fear expressed in several quarters, Mr. Spakes, that businesses would simply cut corners. Obviously, every enterprise is under stress right now, and that there's tremendous temptation for businesses, some, Mr. Hutchinson would call them outliers, as I believe he did on Monday, that they will attempt to cut corners in terms of procedures and standards. Your response?
Well, and for us, our members, and I feel like many of the business community want bad actors to be punished. The people that are cutting corners to us most likely are being willful and would fit to that higher degree. There's certain guidelines, and with this order, if you adhere to those in a good faith fashion, you'll be okay. If you start cutting corners, you're going to open yourself up to liability.
Carter Stein, you get the last word tonight.
Yeah, I would say that this executive order protects the unreasonable actors, right? It won't protect the really, really bad actors who act recklessly or willfully or wantonly or intentionally. But what we have essentially done is given protection to the unreasonable actors, the ones who ignore the CDC guidelines, who ignore the Department of Health directives. And I don't think that's a good precedent for the citizens of Arkansas.
Carter Stein of the bar and Charlie Spakes of the retailers, thank you both very much for being part of the broadcast tonight. Come back. And we'll return in just a moment. And we're back. 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation and 2 months after Appomattox, word that the Civil War had ended reached slaves in Texas on June 19, 1865, thus the origin of Juneteenth, now observed coast to coast. The day has a special resonance in this year of civil unrest, these weeks of protest in every state, including ours. A new awakening, it has been called. Is it? And an awakening to exactly what? We're joined by the executive director of the Mosaic Templars Cultural Center in Little Rock, Christina Shutt, and Sherman Tate, businessman and civic leader long active in the Human Rights Campaign. Welcome to both of you, and thank you for joining us. Ms. Shutt, let's begin with you. What is Juneteenth? I'm an old white guy. To a much younger African-American woman, what does Juneteenth this year mean?
Well, I think Juneteenth is really about, of course, historically celebrating freedom, but I think it also, throughout the years, has continued to resonate the story of hope. That Juneteenth was about people hoping for a better world, for a world in which they had a seat at the table, in which they were included, in which racism didn't exist. And I think that this year is really underscoring that message of hope. That we now have more people, particularly members of the white community, taking to the streets because that message is starting to resonate with them, that they want to see an end to anti-Black racism. So
this hope that you speak of, it came out of anger, despair, particularly this year.
Sure. Well, much of the African-American story comes from this place of oppression, of being people who were oppressed for in the United States for 400 years. And but even in the midst of that, right, we see these stories of survival and of thriving. We see and talk about at the museum on a regular basis the stories of African-American women who started their own businesses in a time where very few women in this country had businesses. These women didn't even have the right to vote, right? But they're starting businesses. We see, stories of civil rights leaders who are fighting for equal pay for teachers. So even in the midst of oppression, there's always this kind of strand of survival and thriving.
Yeah, Sherman Tate, you are at least 1 year older than Ms. Shutt. Give us your perspective.
Thank you, Steve. Well, first of all, I agree with what Ms. Shutt said. The whole process since the Emancipation Proclamation, as she stated, it created hope. It was built, and our dreams and aspirations were built on that hope. And it was and continues to be a frustrating situation when we find out that our dreams are going to be, and indeed have been and continue to be, hampered by the hatred and the racism that continues to exist. I think what has happened recently has added new enthusiasm, if you will, new energy to the Black community for certain, and an increased number of persons from the white community, because I'm getting personally, but we, the Urban League, we're getting calls from people, whites, that want to be involved. They're asking what they can do, how they can do it, and that gives hope. But I'm hopeful because it's going to take people from both sides of the track, Steve, if you will, in order, and always has. I mean, the civil rights movement of the 60s, it had to have and did have support from the white community as well as the Black community. And that's why it was able to succeed and gain the freedoms that we historically had not enjoyed, that we could enjoy.
Well,
go ahead.
Sorry, Ms. Tate, or Mr. Sherman, both you and Ms. Shutt have mentioned this, but Sherman, I'll go back to you first. Mr. Tate, I'll go back to you first. Both of you have cited what I think anyone who has watched television or read a newspaper has seen, and that is the enormous number of white faces in the demonstrations across the country. It's not that white people weren't involved in movement days back in the 60s and 50s, 60s, and 70s, but at times it was almost a preponderance of white faces in some of these demonstrations, which tells us what? Sherman?
Well, I lost part of your question there, but if I understand what you were saying,
this year it just seems increasingly stunningly biracial this year, or triracial even.
I think that what has happened is individuals from the white community who were not and have not been racist, even though they may have, some of them come out of a racist environment, they want to see things change as well, and they're willing to participate and work with the Black community in trying to make these changes come about. And seeing Mr. Floyd and the policeman on his neck, those are deplorable incidents and actions that I think motivate people of all races, those that care, to come forth and say, okay, enough is enough. What can we do? And that's what we're seeing. And I'm delighted to see that. Now, I will close by saying, I'm not optimistic. We're going to always have those that hate. But if we can get the majority of the people across this country that says, no, we're not going to tolerate that, then we can keep moving and make a lot of progress all across the board, Steve.
Ms. Shutt?
Yeah, so I will add to say that I do think social media has had a tremendous impact on the movement because people are seeing things in their face more often. And that's not to dismiss the Black deaths that happened before. Right? People like Trayvon Martin. But I think we've seen, again, increasing numbers of people watching online. I think in addition, people haven't had anywhere to go, right? You can't be distracted by sporting events or other, going to restaurants or other things that people would typically do, in part because of the public health crisis related to COVID. And so if you're sitting at home and you're watching these things, if you're being isolated in these ways, that's one way in which it adds. The other thing that I can't I think it can't be discounted is the fact that we've seen an increasing number of young people. So not just whites, but particularly that young 16 to 25, 16 to 30, even people younger than that. I saw some marches with middle school age kids in it. So we're seeing younger people out in the streets marching. And I think there's been particularly over the last, I would say, 3 years, an increase in young activists. So you think back to the Women's March or marches for science or other of these kinds of large-scale marches that people are getting more and more interest in getting actively involved in the democratic process.
That was going to be my next question, Ms. Shutt, and to Sherman Tate as well. Can this passion we have seen for issues for justice, can it be sustained, particularly among the young, Ms. Shutt?
Yeah, I hope so. I really do hope that this is something where people won't move on to the next news cycle. I think there is a real ease in doing this, right, to moving on. But I will say that there does seem to be something different about this time. And not just because we're seeing, younger people, but we're also seeing people worldwide. It's pretty incredible when you see the images out of, France and London and the Middle East and just places all around the world where they are marching in solidarity for Black lives. So I think that also is telling us that there's something that's a little bit different about this movement that was maybe different from those beforehand, as well as the pretty quick way in which a lot of the kind of corporate owners, corporate sponsors, corporations have responded. They've been very quick to, declare Juneteenth a holiday for their employees. Or I think I saw a story about Band-Aids coming out in different shades. So I think the fact that some of that stuff is happening as well, I think is a sign that there's maybe a new movement and a real turning point in U.S. history.
Yeah, Sherman Tate, you have seen these passions rise and subside over the decades. Do you see anything different this time?
I do, and Ms. Shutt's just covered it to a great extent there. And that is, we have generations of people, both white and black, young to older people, that are involved with this, stating this displeasure and participating in the movement that has taken place and that is growing. And as she said, one of the unique aspects of what we're seeing now is worldwide. And I think that speaks volumes. And politically, it's going to be interesting to see that, see if this, the image of our country, of America, is improved, and because it's going to take good leadership from all, corporate, politically, and otherwise. But the other thing, it's going to take some real dialogue at the local level. And as an example, we, through the Urban League, we are organizing, as we speak, a series of community sessions. And of course, this virus is going to hinder us because you can't put a bunch of people in a room, or you shouldn't put a bunch of people in a room, and we're not going to do that. But as soon as we can, but on a smaller scale and on the telephone, we're having conversations with people and answering questions and asking them what they want to do and what they're concerned about and how they feel about what they're seeing. And it's amazing. And the younger school-age kids, they're involved in it. But again, we got to have some dialogue and make sure everybody's on the same sheet of music, and that we're educating people regarding the real issues and come up with a very valid strategic plan that we can continue to go forward with in addressing these issues that involve policemen, but far beyond that. It's not just that the policemen doing what they're doing because they're getting encouragement, or those that are doing it, they're getting encouragement from folks that are not policemen that says, do this. And I'll give you one example. And Steve, I spoke against this in last legislative session, the gun laws. Think about the gun laws, and I'm not talking about gun laws with respect to policemen, although there has to be some addressing of how they handle their weapons when they pull them before they shoot and what the circumstances need to be. But you can go and buy any kind of weapon you want and walk around with it or carry it in your vehicle, you know, military assault rifles and all. And when you really think about it, the NRA has influenced through the most conservative groups across this country, legislators, to the extent that these laws have been passed. And that makes no sense. And a lot of states have implemented this these stand your ground laws, and it's going to come up in our legislature again, and we're going to be up there speaking against it. These issues have to go, and these are examples of what we need to do as part of the overall agenda to try to get some common sense and some calmness in the community about how you're going to be treated, and if a policeman stops you and so forth.
I hate to have to end it here but we're simply out of time. Ms. Shutt, Sherman, Tate, thank you both of us. Thanks to both of you for coming into the conversation. Thanks so much, and we'll have you back.
Thank you.
Stay tuned. Something important is coming up. It's an encore production replay of Healing the Divide, Race Relations in Arkansas, program examining how race permeates, affects the lives of Arkansans. My friend Dr. Malcolm Glover and guests, his associates, discuss topics: race, police brutality, racial history, disparities, community interaction, an entire spectrum.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.